The judge opened the envelope I'd handed him, scanned the first page, and let out a short, surprised laugh that echoed strangely in that quiet courtroom. "Well," he said, looking up over his glasses, "this changes everything." My ex-husband's smile vanished so fast it was almost comedic. His girlfriend, sitting 3 rows behind him in a dress that cost more than my monthly rent, froze completely, her earlier smirk dissolving into something closer to panic. 10 minutes earlier, Marcus had leaned toward me at the defense table, close enough that only I could hear him, and said, "You'll never see another penny of my fortune. You should have thought about that before you decided to embarrass yourself with this hearing." His girlfriend, Kayla, had laughed audibly from the gallery. "She didn't earn a thing," she'd said to the woman beside her, not bothering to lower her voice. 16 years of doing nothing while he built that company. I hadn't responded to either of them. I'd simply reached into my bag, pulled out a plain manila envelope I'd been carrying for 3 months, and handed it to my attorney to pass forward to the judge. 16 years of marriage, and Marcus genuinely believed I'd contributed nothing to the empire he'd built. He believed that so completely that he'd never once considered what might happen if someone finally organized every quiet contribution I'd made into something impossible to dismiss. He had no idea what was actually inside that envelope. Neither did Kayla, sitting behind him with her perfectly manicured hands frozen mid-clap from whatever victory she'd assumed was already hers. The judge cleared his throat and turned to the next page. "My name is Diane Kowalski, though for 16 years I went by Diane Reyes. Married to a man who built Reyes Analytics from a 2-person startup into a company worth nearly $400 million. I met Marcus when we were both 24, him fresh out of an engineering program with nothing but a laptop and an idea about predictive software. Me working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown. I want you to understand something before I explain what was in that envelope. I didn't spend 16 years doing nothing, the way Kayla so casually announced to a stranger in that courtroom gallery. I spent the first 6 years of our marriage working alongside Marcus in ways that never appeared on any official paperwork, because at the time, neither of us thought to document any of it. We were young, in love, building something together, and it never occurred to either of us that together would someday become a legal battle over who actually contributed what. I'd left my analyst job 2 years into our marriage, not to become a housewife, as Marcus's later court filings implied, but because Reyes Analytics needed someone who understood financial modeling more than it needed my modest salary at another company. I built the company's first 3 investor pitch decks. I personally negotiated our first office lease when Marcus was too anxious to handle the conversation himself. I managed payroll for the first 4 years, unofficially, unpaid, because unofficially was simply how our marriage operated back then. By the time Reyes Analytics could afford a real financial department, I'd quietly stepped back, focusing on raising our 2 children while Marcus's public role in the company grew. That transition felt natural at the time. It felt like partnership, like 2 people supporting each other's contributions in different seasons of the same shared life. What I didn't fully understand until the divorce proceedings began was that none of my early work existed anywhere official. No stock, no formal title, no paper trail proving I'd been anything more than a supportive spouse standing quietly beside a successful man. Marcus's lawyers built their entire strategy around exactly that gap. Marcus's legal team, led by a sharp, expensive attorney named Foster Whitlock, built their case around a simple, devastating narrative. Reyes Analytics was entirely Marcus's creation, built through his singular vision and effort, with my role limited to supportive spouse and homemaker during the years the company actually grew into something valuable. The first time I heard that phrase in a deposition, supportive spouse and homemaker, something in me went cold in a way anger alone couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just inaccurate. It was a calculated erasure, designed to minimize my claim to the company's value by pretending the early years, the years I'd actually built alongside him, simply hadn't happened the way I remembered them. My own attorney, a capable but overworked woman named Priya Sharma, warned me early on that without documentation, proving my contributions during those first 6 years would be extraordinarily difficult. Courts favor paper trails, she told me. Memories and verbal agreements rarely hold up against a company's official incorporation documents. I left that meeting feeling something I hadn't expected. Not defeat, but a strange, sharpening clarity. If Marcus and his team were building their case entirely on the absence of documentation, then somewhere, buried in 16 years of shared life, there had to be something that proved otherwise. I spent the next several weeks doing something neither Marcus nor his attorneys expected. I didn't hire a forensic accountant immediately. I didn't file aggressive countermotions. I went home, into storage boxes I hadn't opened in years, into old email accounts I'd nearly forgotten the passwords to, into the attic of the house I was still, technically, living in during the separation. I was looking for proof of a version of our marriage Marcus's lawyers were trying to convince a judge never existed. What I found, 3 weeks into that search, changed the entire trajectory of the case. The first thing I found was an old external hard drive, buried in a box labeled Taxes 2011, containing backups of an email account I'd used exclusively for Raya's analytics business during those first 2 years. I'd forgotten it even existed, a separate account Marcus had set up for me back when we still operated out of a converted garage, back when Raya's analytics was just the two of us and a shared dream. Inside were hundreds of emails. Correspondence with our first 3 investors, all sent from my account, all containing detailed financial projections I'd personally built. Contract negotiations with our first office landlord, entirely handled by me while Marcus focused on the technical development. Payroll spreadsheets, informal but detailed, showing I'd managed compensation for our first 6 employees for nearly 2 years before we could afford a dedicated HR person. None of it had been formalized. No title, no salary, no stock options. But it was all there, time-stamped, undeniable, a complete record of exactly the kind of foundational work Marcus's legal team claimed I'd never done. I brought everything to Priya the following week. She went quiet as she scrolled through email after email, her expression shifting from cautious optimism to something closer to genuine excitement. "This is significant," she said finally. "This isn't just supportive spouse activity. This is documented executive-level contribution during the company's most critical formation period. If we can establish that your labor during this time was equivalent to what Marcus would have had to pay a co-founder or senior executive, it fundamentally changes how the court should value your contribution to the company's growth." I sat with that for a long moment, understanding for the first time that the case wasn't lost simply because paperwork hadn't existed. It had just been waiting, quietly, for someone to actually look for it. "There's more," I told her. "I haven't gone through everything yet." Over the following month, working quietly while Marcus's team remained confident in their supportive spouse narrative, Priya and I built something far more comprehensive than either of us initially expected. Old text messages, recovered from a cloud backup I'd forgotten existed, where Marcus himself referred to me as his co-founder during a stressful negotiation in year 3. A handwritten notebook from those early days, filled with financial projections in my own handwriting, dated and detailed enough to establish a clear timeline. Most importantly, Priya brought in a forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Rachel Osei, who spent 3 weeks calculating what my documented contributions would have realistically cost Raya's analytics to replace with hired professionals during those foundational years. Her final valuation, based on comparable executive compensation for co-founder-level financial and operational work, was staggering, far higher than either of us had anticipated. "If the court accepts this valuation," Priya explained, "it doesn't just support a larger settlement. It fundamentally repositions you, legally, as someone who helped build the company's early value, not someone who simply benefited from Marcus's success afterward." Marcus, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of what we'd assembled. Through the discovery process, we'd been careful, strategic, filing our findings only in the final weeks before the hearing, giving his legal team minimal time to construct a counter-narrative before the court date arrived. Foster Whitlock had built an entire case on the assumption that I had nothing beyond my word. He'd advised Marcus, apparently with total confidence, that the settlement negotiations would favor Marcus significantly, that I'd likely accept a modest settlement rather than fight a battle I had no real ammunition for. I let that assumption stand right up until the morning of our hearing, walking into that courtroom with a plain manila envelope that Marcus and Kayla had no reason to suspect contained anything more than routine paperwork. They were about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption had been. The judge continued reading through the documentation, his earlier chuckle giving way to a more focused, serious expression as he moved through page after page of emails, financial projections, and Rachel Osei's detailed valuation report. "Mr. Whitlock," the judge said finally, looking up at Marcus's attorney, "I'd like to understand why none of this was addressed in your client's characterization of the petitioner's role during the company's formation years." Foster Whitlock, visibly caught off guard, requested a brief recess to review the documents with his client. During that recess, I watched Marcus's expression cycle through disbelief, anger, and something that looked almost like the beginning of shame. As he scanned emails he'd clearly forgotten existed, messages where his own words, years earlier, contradicted everything his legal team had built their case around. Kayla leaned toward him, whispering something urgent, but Marcus barely acknowledged her, too focused on the documentation spread across the defense table. When court resumed, Foster Whitlock's confident tone from earlier had noticeably shifted. "Your Honor, we'd like to request time to properly review this new evidence before proceeding further." The judge nodded. "Granted. But I'll note for the record that the petitioner's documentation appears substantial and directly relevant to the equitable distribution question at hand. I'd strongly encourage both parties to reconsider their settlement positions before we reconvene." That recommendation, delivered with the quiet authority only a judge can carry, effectively ended Marcus's confidence in the courtroom that day. We reconvened 3 weeks later, not for continued hearing, but for a formal settlement conference, one where Marcus's legal team arrived with a significantly different offer than the one they dismissively floated before my envelope changed everything. I didn't ask for revenge in that negotiation. I asked for what the documentation actually supported, a settlement that reflected 16 years of genuine partnership, not the erased, minimized version Marcus had tried to convince a judge was the truth. The settlement we reached 3 weeks later gave me a fair share of the company's value, calculated honestly against the years I'd actually helped build it, not the years someone decided to remember conveniently. Marcus kept operational control of Reyes Analytics, which was never something I wanted to take from him. I never wanted to destroy what we'd built together. I only wanted the truth of how we'd built it acknowledged, on paper, in a way nobody could erase again. Kayla and Marcus are still together, as far as I know. I don't think about that as much as people probably expect me to. What I think about more is my kids, who are old enough now to understand pieces of what happened, and who I hope will grow up understanding that quiet, unglamorous work still counts, even when nobody thinks to write it down at the time. I kept that hard drive. I still have it, actually, tucked away in a drawer in my new apartment, a strange little relic of the years I almost let someone convince me didn't matter. I don't regret the 16 years I spent building a life and a company alongside Marcus. I don't even regret stepping back from the company's official structure to raise our kids. What I regret is almost believing, for a while during that divorce, that stepping back meant I'd never really been there at all. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself since that morning in the courtroom. If someone tried to rewrite your contribution out of a story you helped build, would you have let it go quietly? Or would you have gone looking for the proof, the way I did, until the truth couldn't be dismissed anymore?